It was a humid evening in Atlanta, Georgia, and the city pulsed with a life of its own. People bustled about on crowded sidewalks and car horns blared from the traffic-jammed streets. For Officer Rick Johnson, it was just another evening on duty, filled with the typical mix of minor disturbances and routine patrols. But tonight, his life was about to change. The call came through his radio just after 7:45 p.m. A seemingly ordinary call, nothing that would usually pique his interest. But as he pulled up to the scene, he had no idea he was about to confront someone powerful, someone with influence beyond his wildest imagination. There, under the dim glow of a streetlight, stood a black woman, tall and elegant, her silhouette exuding an undeniable strength. As Officer Johnson approached her, his instincts kicked in, and he found himself reacting quickly, aggressively. His assumptions about who she was would trigger a series of events that would soon spin out of his control, leaving him to face a devastating revelation. By the end of the night, he would come face to face with the true identity of this woman. And with it, he would realize just how much he stood to lose. Atlanta's downtown area was particularly alive that evening, with the lights from buildings reflecting off the rain-soaked streets. Officer Rick Johnson, a man hardened by 15 years on the force, was wrapping up his shift, looking forward to heading home. The coffee he held in his hand was his third of the night, a bitter reminder of the long hours and the often ungrateful nature of the job. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 7:45 p.m. Just 15 minutes more, he thought, before his shift ended. But just as he took a sip, the radio crackled to life with a call. Suspicious individual near Fifth Avenue and Peachtree Street, possibly loitering by a black Mercedes. Officer assistance requested. Johnson felt a pang of annoyance but acknowledged the call. This late at night, he muttered to himself, people just don't know when to go home. Setting his coffee down, he flicked on the siren and navigated his way through the maze of one-way streets. As he approached the location, his eyes landed on a black Mercedes parked under a dim streetlight. Beside it stood a tall black woman, her figure shrouded by the shadows but unmistakably poised. She wore a white suit, immaculate and professional, her heels clicking against the pavement as she checked her phone. Johnson felt an inexplicable surge of frustration as he pulled up and got out of his car. "Ma'am, may I ask what you're doing here?" Johnson's voice was brisk, carrying the weight of authority. The woman lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with a calm, unwavering gaze. "I'm waiting for someone," she replied, her voice smooth, composed, and strikingly confident. Something about her tone set Johnson on edge. It was as if she expected his question, as if she was prepared for this confrontation. "I'll need to see some ID," he demanded, holding out his hand. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into her bag and handed him her ID. He glanced down at it, reading the name. Dr. Olivia Monroe. The name didn't ring a bell, and he barely registered her title. He handed it back to her with a scowl. "You mind stepping away from the vehicle?" She hesitated, a frown crossing her face. "Officer, I don't see why that's necessary. I've given you my ID. I've done nothing wrong." But Johnson's patience was already thin. "Look, I asked you to step aside from the vehicle," he repeated, his tone hardening. Without waiting for her response, he reached forward and took her by the arm, pulling her back. But as he did, a small crowd began to gather, some bystanders pulling out their phones, recording the interaction. She winced but maintained her composure. "This is unnecessary, officer," she said softly, but her words were drowned out by the commotion. What neither of them realized was that those videos would soon go viral, sparking outrage and starting a chain reaction that would alter both of their lives forever. Back at the precinct, Johnson felt a lingering sense of unease. The way the woman, Dr. Monroe, had looked at him, calm, unbothered, almost amused, kept replaying in his mind. He shrugged it off, assuming she was another defiant citizen trying to give him a hard time. As he processed her paperwork, he avoided looking too deeply into her credentials, brushing off her title and the sense of authority she exuded. Meanwhile, Dr. Monroe sat in a holding cell, her expression unchanging. She was calm, serene even, as if she were merely waiting for the inevitable. Her confidence had not wavered, and as whispers started circulating around the precinct about her identity, officers began to gather, watching the incident video with growing concern. Captain Marcus Reynolds, known for his firm but fair leadership, entered the precinct. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Johnson, who seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him. The captain motioned for Johnson to follow him to his office, closing the door behind them. "Johnson, did you even look at her ID?" Reynolds asked, his voice low and controlled. Johnson frowned, unsure of the significance. "Yeah, some doctor or something. Why?" Reynolds let out a heavy sigh, his expression filled with disappointment. "Olivia Monroe isn't just some doctor. She's the Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights, one of the most powerful people in the nation when it comes to enforcing laws around police conduct and civil liberties. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've just created?" Johnson's face paled. The words echoed in his mind. Deputy Attorney General for Civil Rights. He looked down at his hands, the realization of his actions hitting him like a freight train. This wasn't just a procedural mistake. This was a career-ending disaster. The morning headlines were relentless. News articles, social media posts, and television broadcasts all carried variations of the same story. Police officer detains high-ranking civil rights official. The footage recorded by the bystanders showed Johnson's harsh treatment, and the public's outrage was palpable. Hashtags like #Justice for Olivia and #End Police Bias exploded across social media, fueling the firestorm. As the day unfolded, Johnson found himself facing inquiries from his superiors, a meeting with internal affairs, and the simmering anger of the community. But the most chilling moment came when Dr. Monroe herself sat across from Captain Reynolds in a conference room, her presence casting a heavy shadow over the room. "I want you to understand," she began, addressing the captain but letting her gaze drift toward Johnson, who sat quietly in the corner, "that this isn't about me. This is about a system that enables officers like him to make decisions based on biases they refuse to acknowledge." Her words were calm, but packed with a force that left Johnson's stomach churning. He could feel the weight of her disappointment, a quiet strength that no amount of training had prepared him for. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, but he knew it would be futile. In the days that followed, the precinct underwent one of the most intense investigations in its history. Dr. Monroe made it clear that her mission was not vengeance, but reform. She demanded accountability, changes in training, and an overhaul in the department's approach to handling cases involving civilians. News stations across the country picked up the story, detailing the changes she was advocating for, her voice becoming a beacon for those who had suffered similar mistreatment. Meanwhile, Johnson was suspended, pending a full review of his conduct. The suspension felt like a prison sentence, as he became the target of public anger and disdain. Friends avoided him, family members questioned him, and even his fellow officers regarded him with a mix of pity and disappointment. One day, he received a letter in the mail, a single envelope with elegant handwriting scrawled across the front. The return address was from Dr. Olivia Monroe's office. With trembling hands, he opened it, the weight of the message within making him feel as if the walls were closing in around him. "Officer Johnson," the letter began, "I do not hate you, but I cannot allow the actions you took to go unchecked. You serve a community that places its trust in you, and it's your duty to protect that trust. Use this experience as a reminder of the power you wield, and the responsibility that comes with it. Reflect on your actions and perhaps change." The letter ended there, but the impact was profound. Johnson found himself reading it over and over, each line striking deeper than the last. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about every decision he'd made, every person he'd encountered, every assumption he'd let cloud his judgment. With his suspension lifted, Johnson faced a choice: return to the force or leave behind a career that had once been his pride. But something within him had shifted, a growing understanding that he needed to change, not just for himself, but for the people he was supposed to serve. He began attending community meetings, listening to stories from individuals who had experienced similar discrimination and bias. He heard tales of injustice, of people wronged by the very system that had sworn to protect them. The process was painful, forcing him to confront his own prejudices, but it was also eye-opening. Dr. Monroe's efforts went beyond reforming the police department. She initiated programs to foster understanding between law enforcement and the communities they served, using her story as a catalyst for change. Slowly but surely, Atlanta saw changes. New training programs, community outreach efforts, and policies aimed at building trust between officers and civilians. Johnson saw her at one of these events, her calm, authoritative presence a reminder of the consequences of his actions. She spoke with dignity, her voice steady as she recounted her experience. He watched her, understanding that her strength came not from a desire for revenge, but a deep commitment to justice. For Officer Rick Johnson, redemption was not a destination but a journey. He spent years rebuilding his life, learning from the people he had once dismissed. And as he walked the streets of Atlanta, he carried with him the memory of that night, a constant reminder of the power of respect, humility, and the courage to change. For Dr. Olivia Monroe, her ordeal became a symbol of resilience and hope. Her work in Atlanta served as a model for cities nationwide, proving that even the darkest moments can lead to growth and understanding. And as she continued her fight for justice, she inspired others to believe in the possibility of a world where respect was not demanded, but freely given.